organizing this day of events around a timely and critically important issue. I want to just take a moment to recognize the work of AAI staff and bringing us all together here today and dealing with the logistics, including the shuttles. That was nice to have a shuttle from the other hotel. And then really developing a thoughtful and an ambitious agenda. My name is Kamal Essaheb. I'm honored to share the stage with these three experts. Just briefly about me, I'm Director of Policy and Advocacy at an organization called the National Immigration Law Center, and we're a policy and litigation shop that works on a host of immigration issues. So to give you a sense of what we do, we have been deeply engaged in federal, legislative and administrative advocacy on issues related to accessing status, creating more pathways and opportunities for immigrants, particularly those who are undocumented, to get status. We've also played a supporting role to organizations that work on issues at the state and local level that affect immigrants, right? So that's, for example, providing undocumented immigrants access to driver's licenses. That's a big one. Or providing dreamers, that's immigrants who came here at a young age with the opportunity to go to college by paying in-state tuition. And when states and localities do bad things, I mean, those are good things that we help support, but when they do bad things, like Arizona did a few years back, trying to essentially turn their local police force into immigration agents, we sue. So that just gives you a sense of who we are and how we operate. Like I said, I'm thrilled to be on this stage with these three experts. And just to get right to the point, what we're trying to accomplish in this panel, which builds a little bit on the prior conversation, is three things. One is paint a deeper picture of the Syrian refugee crisis. What's the experience of the refugee population? What are its needs? Two, just get a sense of the ongoing humanitarian resettlement efforts by the various actors around the world. What is happening in that space, and what are the gaps? And then three, I think most importantly, to identify things that our government, which is in some ways the most critical global actor, can do to pitch in. The president has pledged to resettle 10,000 Syrian refugees next year, next fiscal year. The U.S. has, I think, already either pledged or contributed $4.5 billion to global humanitarian efforts. But I think to many in the NGO world and even elected officials, that doesn't even scratch the surface of what's needed. So we'd like to get a bit of a dialogue about that. So first up is Annie Sovcik, who's director of the Washington office for the Center for Victims of Torture. Ms. Sovcik has spent almost 10 years working on refugee, asylum, and immigration policies. Prior to joining this organization, she was the advocacy counsel for the Refugee Protection Program at Human Rights First, where she focused on laws and policies impacting refugees seeking asylum in the United States. So first question for you, Annie, is if you could just tell us a little bit about the work of your organization generally, and in particular with respect to the current crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much to the Arab American Institute for having me here today. The Center for Victims of Torture provides trauma rehabilitation services to survivors of torture and severe war atrocities. We operate a clinic in St. Paul, Minnesota, and clinics in Africa and the Middle East, and also provide training and capacity building services to other torture survivor rehabilitation programs throughout the United States and in various parts of the world. Our largest program presently is in Jordan, where we're working with refugee survivors of torture and severe war atrocities. In 2015, we'll serve about 1,000 clients. We'll provide them with group counseling and therapeutic services, as well as physical therapy services, in part to work on actual physical injuries that our clients may be suffering as a result of torture and methods of torture that may have been inflicted upon them, but also working through psychosomatic or other effects of their psychological conditions that may be playing out in terms of physical pain. We also provide social work services, referrals, coordinating with other organizations, helping to connect clients to some of the basic material resources that they may need. Of our 1,000 clients presently, about 750 are Syrian and about 250 are Iraqis. Given the overwhelming need, we will be increasing our services and increasing numbers in the next year, looking to serve about 1,500 survivors, with about 1,000 being Syrian and about 500 being Iraqi. Of our Syrian clients, about half are children. We run groups of children as young as 3 and 4, and then also have adolescent groups of teenagers that we divide based on age, but also on gender. And I can speak more to kind of what we're seeing and the issues and challenges that our clients are facing, both in terms of reports of violations and experiences that they've had, both in Syria as well as in Iraq, but the present challenges that they're facing as refugees in Jordan. But I'll maybe elaborate on that later.
Yeah, sounds great. So I'll move on to Jen and basically ask her the same question. But first, let me introduce her. Jen is the Associate Director of Immigration and Refugee Policy at Church World Service, where she has been for more than 6 years, which in DC land is a very, very long time, an impossibly long time. In this position, Ms. Smyers meets with national policymakers to advocate for improved assistance for refugees resettled in the United States and immigration reform that reunites families and creates a path to citizenship for individuals who are undocumented. Jen, what are you hearing from your European partners about their experience on the ground with respect to this crisis?
Yeah, so Church World Service is a body of 38 different Protestant denominations working mainly in the United States. We resettle refugees through 33 different affiliate and local offices in 22 states. And our partner in Europe is Church's Commission on Migration in Europe. And we've heard a lot of conversation from them about what's happening there. Germany certainly taking more leadership than other European nations in terms of committing to resettle or admit 1 million Syrians in terms of refugees, asylees, humanitarian admissions, and other programs. But at the same time, Germany, as well as other nations, Austria, Hungary has been the one probably to take the strongest stance in enforcing their borders and cutting off access to territory and protection for people who are seeking asylum, who are fleeing for their lives. And very, very concerning, especially considering that these nations who are putting in these border restrictions are all signatory to the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, where they have said, we will not return people back into harm's way. We will not prevent people from seeking protection, but that in fact is exactly what they're doing. So I think there's a real desire from our European partners' stance, as well as our partners in the region, to make sure that we lift up what refugees need at every step in their journey, making sure that refugees have the ability to work, the ability to have their children attend school, wherever that might be, whether that's in Jordan, Turkey, Hungary, Austria, etc. And I think that that's really where we need to be focusing on making sure that all countries are doing their part. In terms of the United States, we've been doing a lot of advocacy in our push to have the United States admit more Syrian refugees, and this can really be used as a leverage point in our humanitarian and foreign policy to say the United States is doing our part, and thus our expectation of host countries, of countries in Europe, is that they allow refugees to work, allow refugee children to attend school, making sure that countries are not closing doors to access to important protection. But I think that we are seeing this debate play out in the public both in the United States and in Europe, between our worst instincts as human beings, and that has manifested itself in anti-refugee sentiment, and our best ideals in terms of people who have, extended great hospitality and welcome to people. So I think with our European partners and with our U.S. advocacy, just holding every single nation accountable. This is a global refugee crisis. No one's off the hook. Everyone needs to be demonstrating leadership, and that leadership can then be leveraged to hold other countries accountable to what they need to be doing as well.
Thanks, Jen. I want to move on to Britanny. Britanny Vanderhoof is currently Policy Counsel at HIAS. In this position, Ms. Vanderhoof is responsible for assisting the policy team's federal and state legislative efforts. She also coordinates the Legislative Circle listserv, which is a tool for communicating with advocates and policymakers across the country, and monitors human trafficking legislation in all 50 states and in Congress. Britanny, can you tell us a little bit about HIAS's efforts historically and on this particular crisis? How is this different or similar than other crises from the past?
Sure, thank you. Well, I'm so happy to be here with you all today. So HIAS was founded in the 1880s in New York, and our primary mission then was as a charity organization, and we were helping Jews fleeing Russia from the pogroms, basically. And we continued that work, primarily assisting Jewish populations, but other populations as well, coming to the United States, fleeing persecution. We were helping refugees before there even was a legal definition of what a refugee was. In the 1990s, when we saw the slowing down of Jewish migration to the United States, we decided to take that 120 years worth of experience with helping refugees and began helping all refugees coming to the United States and globally. We founded our first international office in 2001 in Kenya, and we've been operational in Africa ever since. We also have offices in Central and South America, as well as in Europe. In the United States, we are a resettlement agency along with Church World Service, and so our job is to work with our affiliates in states to ensure a welcome for refugees, regardless of where they're coming from or what their background is. Internationally, we provide livelihood assistance, so that's helping refugees to become self-sufficient in the countries that they're living in. We also provide psychosocial services, as well as legal services. In terms of what we are doing, particularly around Syria, we don't have any operations in the region, so a lot of our work has been focused on the resettlement aspect. So what can we be doing to increase resettlement into the United States, and also to make sure that there are services and welcome for them once they arrive. We are also active on the advocacy work. So again, getting those resettlement numbers up, and also looking at how we can better streamline the refugee process so that we can be increasing those numbers. It was mentioned earlier today that it takes on average about 18 to 24 months for someone to be referred and then arrive to the United States. We think we can do better, and so a big part of HIAS's work and advocacy has been trying to figure out what resources are needed and what changes need to be made to the system in order to make that happen.
What are some of the barriers that keep the processing time that long? I mean, does it have to be that long?
Sure. So some of the barriers are legal. We have a very rigorous security screening process, and I don't think anyone would say that we don't need that. We can make it better. We can reduce redundancies. There are also a number of medical checks and other screenings that happen when you are talking about bringing someone into the country. How can we line those up and make them sort of work together as opposed to sort of being barriers against each other? A lot of it is also resource. Comes down to a lack of resources. We don't have enough U.S. Customs and Immigration Service officers in the region doing interviews to bring people here. A lot of our processing is stalled in countries. Lebanon, for example, we don't do any processing out of Lebanon. In Iraq, most refugee interviews just began after the office was shut down in Baghdad for 9 months. So there are a number of issues sort of related to getting those resources in place so that we can be bringing more people in.
I'm going to go back to Annie for a second. You started to talk about the special challenges that you're seeing in this crisis. Can you flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah, so I'll just say, from a mental health perspective, that generally in an emergency setting, rates of sort of common, emotional disorders, will increase from a rate of about 10% to a rate of about 10 to 20%. The International Medical Corps has done some surveys on Syrian refugees in particular, and found that about 54% are suffering from symptoms of depression or anxiety. And then amongst Syrian children, about 26.6% are facing certain intellectual development disorders, which many of these can be directly associated with trauma and past traumatic experiences they've had, with about 3.6% of children also suffering severe emotional disorders. The services that CVT provides, when we have people who come into our office, we're assessing prospective clients on the basis of functionality. And so we have clients who are coming to us, and pretty much any refugee could benefit from some type of psychosocial support services or some type of services to help them process some of the traumatic experiences that they've had. But because of limited resources and limited capacity, really only able to take people who are actually having issues with basic functioning. So people are coming in with suicidal ideations, who are coming in who have depression on a level that a single mother to get up and to care for her children is a struggle. People who are sort of talking in very fatalistic terms about their own future, who are suffering from a real sense of hopelessness. And we're seeing an increase of that as the situation becomes more and more protracted. Early on, even as we had high numbers of Syrians coming to us in search of support, oftentimes coming to us in search of support for their children because they were seeing significant differences in their children as a result of witnessing bombings, witnessing the killing of a family member, witnessing the torture of their father, witnessing the rape of their mother. But the children were coming in with symptoms such as they hadn't talked for a while. They were expressing aggressive behavior, particularly sort of skittish and reacting to noises in a disproportionate way, fear of strangers. There were some children who were suffering from severe nightmares, and parents who would describe them as I don't recognize my child anymore. But then also sort of seeing that with themselves. There had been changes, and with other family members, there had been changes. And offering these kinds of supports helps people both process the past, as well as offering certain positive coping skills and helping with positive resilience for the present. And I think as the present continues and the circumstances seem less and less like there are options for them, the harder life has become for refugees. Early on, many of our Syrian clients were talking about going home. They thought it was going to be a temporary situation. They thought, maybe I'll be here for 3 months, 5 months, maybe a year. And then that year turned into 2 years. It's turned into 3 years. And the prospects, as we heard in the first panel, of peace are seeming more and more dim. And then there's resettlement efforts have been limited at best. But challenges that people are facing, if they had savings, they're gone at this point. Rent is incredibly expensive in Jordan. People are having trouble with housing. Food vouchers have been reduced, or for some people have been cut completely. Access to work and work authorization is incredibly difficult, with very few people actually legally allowed to work. You have people who are working kind of under the table, but with high risk of, if you're caught, you may be returned to a camp or deported back to Syria. And so many families are then taking their kids out of school and sending their kids to work because the risks are reduced for children if they're caught working. This is leading to shifting of family dynamics, as you suddenly have children who are now the primary breadwinners for a family. You have extreme guilt that parents may be feeling because their sense of their primary responsibility being to care for their children and provide future opportunities for their children. They have very little ability to actually affect their present and affect their future, which then leads them to, in many ways, I think, contemplate decisions such as taking the dangerous journey to Europe, or for lack of other options. And just a final point that more and more we hear people talk about the possibility of returning to Syria. But when our clients are talking about returning to Syria, it's not because it would be a voluntary decision to go back because they think it's safe. It's not uncommon for our clients to say things such as, I would rather die in Syria than continue to suffer here. So just to make the plea for increased humanitarian assistance, increased support to Jordanian communities, to Syrians in Jordan as well as in other parts of the region, but also that there needs to be some option for at least some percentage of that population to access third country resettlement, particularly as going home is not a present option for most people.
So we've heard a couple of different things that the U.S. government can do, right? Increase in aid, shorten processing time for refugee applications. Jen, are there other things that the U.S. government can do?
Absolutely. And where there's a will, there's a way. And I think that's a really important place to ground the conversation when it comes to the U.S. government. The administration has many, many different tools in its toolbox, so to speak, when it comes to admitting more refugees in general, and in particular Syrian refugees, and a lot of things that the administration could do without Congress, without any big signing of an executive order or anything. It's just a matter of implementing the resettlement program in a different way. So one is a resource question. The U.S. government could contribute additional resources to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Refugee Agency, to refer more people to the United States for resettlement. But already there are 20,000 people who UNHCR has already referred to the United States, and the United States just needs to go through the processing. Like Brittany said, there's a huge, huge need to put more resources into the Department of Homeland Security so that people can be processed in less than that 2 to 3, sometimes year period of time. There are all of these different validity periods that create a cycle, a domino effect of expiring validity periods. People have to be interviewed twice, maybe 3 times, et cetera, and that needs to be responded to. There are also different things. So UNHCR referrals are considered priority 1 refugees, but priority 2 would be a specific humanitarian designation that the administration can make for a certain group of refugees. So the administration could really say that Syrian refugees in general are a priority 2 category, or they could be a lot more focused and narrow about that. They could say, for instance, I think an easy thing to do would be, right now there are more than 20,000 Syrians who have approved I-130 immigration family reunification petitions, but they're awaiting their priority date to become current. Right now we're processing people who applied for family reunification through our immigration program in December of 2008. That's how long the backlog is. So there are 20,000 people who have approved petitions. They've gone through that family reunification I-130 process, but they're awaiting their date. Why not allow them to await their date with their family safely in the United States? The administration could do this immediately. The administration could also expand the Priority 3 program, which is for family reunification of refugees. Right now, that's a program where if you are a refugee in the United States, you can apply for your family member overseas to join you in the US. Well, most Syrians who are here did not come as refugees because right now we've only resettled 1,911 Syrians. They came with work visas or in other ways. So why not allow Syrians who are here in the United States, either on TPS or other legal status, to sponsor their refugee family members abroad? Again, this is something that the administration could do immediately. I think there are a lot of other pieces in terms of resources. We are very, very distressed that the administration has not requested any additional funds to resettle 15,000 more refugees this year. So this past year we resettled 70,000 refugees. This fiscal year, the administration has said that number will be 85,000 refugees, including 10,000 Syrians. But they have not asked Congress for a dime more. And right now, we're operating on a continuing resolution where we just have the same amount of funds we had last year. And the administration is saying, we're not going to ask for any more funds. Well, to us, that means, are they really serious about bringing in 10,000 Syrians? Or are they going to use lack of resources as an excuse? Well, they would be the ones to blame for not asking Congress for more money. December 11th is when the current continuing resolution appropriations expires. So we have between now and December 11th to push the administration to ask Congress for more money and to push Congress to appropriate more money for the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration under the State Department, for the Department of Homeland Security to do those security checks, and for the Office of Refugee Resettlement to provide really critical services for refugees when they arrive in the U.S. But I think there's a huge lack of political will on the White House in particular right now. There is some glimmers of hope in Congress. Graham and Leahy introduced a bipartisan supplemental bill of $1 billion to help Syrian refugees, and we need the White House to lead, and we need Congress to make sure that the funds are there to admit those refugees and to provide for them once they're here.
Brittany, I want to give you a chance to chime in here. Are there other things, Jen laid out, I guess, a toolbox, the administration's toolbox, if you will, with respect to how they could be more helpful here. Are there other things you'd put on the table? And then the second question I have for you is, if they have all these things they could do, why aren't they doing them?
Sure. So I think Jen gave a really good explanation of sort of what we're dealing with right now. Certainly there are other things that can be done. I think we've seen a real lack of leadership coming from the White House on this. We're also seeing, for the most part, a lack of leadership coming from Congress as well. Unfortunately, when we are talking to congressional offices about resettling refugees, we kind of get the that's terrible, what's happening, and then the conversation immediately almost always switches to the idea of security, and also we'll hear from congressional staffers about the letters they're receiving from their constituents about how they're scared about Syrians coming to their communities, and that's contributing to the lack of political will. Is you have congressional members who might be inclined to do more, but they feel that they are really being tied down by the fact that what they're hearing from their constituents is not support for increased resettlement, but it's fear and concern. So I think one thing that we have been trying to think through is how can we be mobilizing citizens to be that positive voice to their representatives in Congress and demand more action. Unfortunately, it is the fear and frankly racism that is sort of out ahead right now, and we really need to think through how we can be changing that discussion. One thing that HIAS and Refugee Counsel USA has been working on is we've been reaching out to the NGOs that have a lot of experience with this type of sentiment, the anti-hate groups, and how can we be using their experience and their work to really be changing that dialogue and to dispel some of the myths and to really talk through, these are people, these are victims, they're in a really bad humanitarian crisis, and we have the ability to help them, and we should. So that has been a challenge, and that's really contributing, I think, to a lot of this political will. I think in the United States, we're seeing how immigration, it just generally has become highly politicized. And while the refugee issue generally or historically has not been quite as political, we're seeing it being swept up in this conversation of, are you pro-immigration or are you anti-immigration? And unfortunately, I think that is shaping a lot of the conversation around resettlement of refugees in the United States as well.
Jen, can you talk a little bit about how the moment that we're in with respect to the Syrian refugee crisis compares to what this country went through 2 years ago with the unaccompanied children from Central America? And talk a little bit about what the government's response was then and how it compares to the government's response here.
Great question. So I think that our colleagues in Europe last summer were horrified that there were young children who were coming to the United States seeking safety, fleeing violence, fleeing gangs, and that the United States conversation about that was about closing our border. And I think there's actually some real parallels that we can see to the way that we are looking at what's going on in Europe and the Mediterranean and countries closing their doors. And I think that there has been such a positive, I think, overall narrative about the need to respond. And I think in similar ways, our European colleagues are saying, hey, what about when you guys closed your doors and urged Mexico to close their doors to unaccompanied children who are fleeing violence? So I think that there is certainly a racial component to different populations. During the unaccompanied children crisis last summer, there was a member of Congress who's been very, very supportive of humanitarian aid, of refugee protection, and we met with him in his office, and I mean, he was very, very frank at saying, it's just different when they're here. And I couldn't believe it, because that's what every country says, right? Well, if they're our neighbors, if there's more people coming than we, estimated, then we need to cut off protections. And I think that's what you see worldwide, is neighboring countries closing off protections to people who are close by. But I think that it brings up the issue that there are a variety of refugee populations that are not necessarily in the limelight, and we also need to make sure we're not forgetting about them. And I think it was a colleague earlier who mentioned, this isn't new. We tend to maybe romanticize in the past. We brought in 200,000 Vietnamese refugees in the year of 1980 alone. And that was during an economic recession. It was not popular. There was a lot of anti-refugee sentiment, a lot of the same things we're seeing now. The difference was political leadership on behalf of Gerald Ford and then on behalf of Jimmy Carter following him to bring in people and to say these people are going to become part of our communities, and they did. And I think that's the real difference, is that we're not seeing the political and the moral leadership, and we need to see that. And if we can't show that we're willing to accept unaccompanied children at our borders, if we're not willing to show that we're going to demonstrate leadership in refugee protection and resettlement when it comes to the Syrian crisis, what kind of signal does that send to our international partners in keeping their doors open and providing protection?
Mm-hmm. So I have one more question, then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and it's to both Annie and Brittany. So you're, in a room here with individuals who are active in their communities, who have representatives they can speak to about these issues. What are some concrete asks in terms of both, resettlement numbers, types of aid, amounts of aid that that you think are really needed? So if we were to boil it down to the concrete, what should we be as people who care about this issue asking for?
Well, resettlement numbers, and CVT is a member of RCUSA as well as Church World Service and HIAS, and we're all calling for the United States to resettle 200,000 refugees in FY16, with 100,000 of those being Syrian. Jen outlined a variety of options outside of the formal presidential determination and refugee resettlement process that can actually allow for many more Syrians to be able to come to the United States. And again, while resettlement's not going to solve the crisis, it is a critical piece of international burden sharing, and it's critical for the United States to be showing leadership in this area. And I don't need to repeat what Jen said, but just sort of echo that those points are essential in terms of the global response. On humanitarian aid, I actually don't have a specific number, except just to say that the support that needs to be provided to the communities that are hosting the largest numbers of Syrians. Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, it needs to increase. They're overstretched, they're overburdened, they have their own economic and political challenges that are becoming even more tense at this stage. I think the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has been exploring, with the World Bank and others, some interesting ways to sort of combine and make complementary both development and humanitarian assistance. Something needs to change in terms of recognizing that this is not a short-term, immediate emergency response, but rather there are emergency elements to what has become a protracted long-term situation. And the response of international donors and the international community to be supporting these host communities needs to reflect that. And again, I mean, from where my organization sits, and we see, I truly believe that mental health and psychosocial support services need to be an integral component to that. Particularly as we're looking at people who are coping with very difficult circumstances and will be for a long period of time. The more we can provide them with tools to help cope in a positive way, the better off both communities and the long-term situations are going to be.
Brittany?
Great. I would say staying informed in terms of what is happening at the federal level. So that would be, as Jen mentioned, there's the Leahy-Graham supplemental bill in the Senate right now, encouraging your senators to sign on and sponsor that. Also encouraging your congressional members not to sign on to legislation that would hurt refugees, that would make it harder for resettlement to happen. There are a number of bills floating around in the House of Representatives right now that would try to essentially shut down refugee resettlement. So encouraging your representatives not to sign on to those that type of legislation. At the local level, I think that there's a lot that people can do, which is in terms of talking to their state representatives, talking to their mayors and their governors, and letting them know that you want refugees in your community, because that's, when you think about it, that's where the rubber hits the road, right? So because it's the local communities that will be welcoming and integrating refugees into their lives, into their neighborhoods. And when you have cities like Detroit, like Dearborn, that are very vocal about the fact that they want refugees and that they want to provide a welcome, that sends messages, and that's how you build a movement, and that's how you make change at those higher levels. So while talking to your congressman might seem like a drop in the bucket, you definitely should do it. But I think that at that local and state level is really where you can start building a wave that will hope to push that sense of welcome and that sense of we're Americans and this is what we do, and we're ready to do our part, and our community is ready to welcome the people that need a welcome. So I definitely think that at sort of all levels of government there are ways to interact and to make your voice and your opinion heard.
Okay. All right, we'll open it up for Q&A. Where's the mic? All right. And what we'll do, I see a lot of hands raised, so what we'll do is we'll probably take 3 questions and 3 questions at a time, and then give the panelists a chance to answer. Go ahead.
My name is Numan Awisa from Iowa City, Iowa. I'm Syrian American, and I have a couple questions, I guess. The refugee rate to Europe is on the rate of about 6,000 to 10,000 refugee a day going into Europe these days. And we are talking here about a few thousands in the United States. So the scale is huge compared to what the problem is. And I'm just curious, presidential candidate Martin O'Malley said he would like to admit 130,000 in the next 2 years. Do you rate any of the presidential candidates and their positions on this issue?
Okay. All right, next question.
I was wondering if you could comment on the legal definitions and the distinctions between a refugee and asylee and how that impacts your work. And as we're getting better numbers of the makeup of the migrants, a lot of them are not your typical Syrians that are fleeing the war, but also those that are fleeing the derivatives of war, whether it be those from Pakistan and Afghanistan and so forth. And how does that impact your work?
Okay, and we'll take one more in this round.
Get some from this side.
What's that?
Dahan Najjar, the Yemeni American Benevolent Association and the International Council for Rights and Freedoms. Thank you for sharing the refugee issues with us. I'm happy to hear that our government is taking care of the Syrian refugee. But as you know, in the Middle East, there is a lot of doomed countries who are in a real war. Like Yemen, it's an ongoing war since 2014. And in Libya, there is a crisis there that concerns everyone. I hope our government will pay attention these two countries and take care of the refugees that they are all over the world, from China to Europe. And no one is talking about them. And two questions for Smyers and Britanny. You're working outside, as I know, in Jordan. Do you accept any application there for those people who are coming from Yemen or Libya? And for Britanny, because I heard that you have regional office in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya. We have refugee camp in Djibouti, and that camp is not for the human life. I think it's in a bad situation. Are you willing to help those refugees, Yemenis refugees that came to Djibouti? One more thing I want to bring to your attention, that's specifically for Yemen. The land borders with the Arabian states of Gulf, Saudi Arabia and Oman are closed for Yemenis. They cannot pass the borders. That's why you do not see a huge fleet of refugees from Yemen. Those who want to go to Djibouti, they have no transportation. And I think you heard about those families that died on the sea when they were trying to escape the war and go to Djibouti or Ethiopia. Thank you.
Okay. So Jen will answer the first question about presidential candidates. Annie will answer the second, which implicated a couple of issues, and then some combination of Jen and Brittany will address the third.
Great. So great question about the presidential candidates. Church World Service, I think like all of us on here, are nonprofit 501c3 organizations, so we don't endorse a candidate or a political party, but I think that it's really important that we pay attention to what candidates at all levels of office who are running are saying when it comes to Syrian refugees. I think that Martin O'Malley's call for 130 over 2 years is certainly doable. Our call is for 100,000 this year, and we'd look to next year to increase that. But I think that the reason that he's likely speaking to us later today is because he's demonstrated some leadership on this. And certainly when it comes to unaccompanied children crisis last summer, he's been a leader there. I know that Chris Christie made comments recently that he does not think that we should be accepting Syrian refugees, and I think that that needs to, be responded to by the community. I think when it comes to all of the places where candidates are eating cheeseburgers or chili or taking pictures with babies and American flags, we need to ask them these questions, and we need to make sure that we're bird dogging, so to speak, and asking them questions in very intentional ways that our communities want to welcome Syrian refugees and refugees from all over the world, and how would you respond to the U.S.'s international obligation, and how is the U.S. going to lead in these crises? I think that needs to be asked to a lot more of the candidates, and they need to know that our communities are showing up to vote.
Annie?
Yeah, and I'm going to comment on the final question and then move to the question about legal definitions. But just to say thank you for raising that. All of our groups are working with different refugee populations from around the world. We are working in the Dadaab refugee camp with Somali refugees. We're working in northern Ethiopia with Eritrean refugees. We're one of the largest populations that we're serving out of our clinic in Minnesota are refugees from Ethiopia. We're working with refugees from the DRC, from Burma, and I could go on and on and on. I mean, as Senator Durbin opened up with, that presently we're looking at the largest forcibly displaced population in the world since World War II, with about 60 million people forcibly displaced from their homes. And a high percentage of that is Syrians, but the attention to the Syrian refugee crisis should not displace the attention to other refugee crises in different parts of the world. So on the legal question specifically, so the question was, what's the difference between a refugee and an asylee? So very basically, a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of the 5 protected grounds, race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, who their government either is unwilling or unable to protect, has crossed an international border, and is thus, deserving of international protection. So it's the definition that is actually prescribed in the 1968 protocol to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. In the United States, we have a particular distinction between refugees and asylees that actually all asylees have to meet the refugee definition in US laws. But the difference in the United States is that refugees are individuals who have been identified and been granted status and gone through all of their security checks and medical clearances, et cetera, overseas. And when they're brought into the United States, they arrive with the status of refugee. Asylees, by contrast, or asylum seekers, are those who arrive at the border or are in the interior of the United States and are here requesting protection as a refugee. And so they go through the legal process here in the United States to determine whether they qualify, and they then become an asylee if they're granted status. And something that is of just a particular kind of legal distinction is that our obligations under international law to not return refugees really do apply in the situation of when there are refugees who are here in the United States, so people who are applying for asylum or people who may be facing return home. Whereas the US, the Refugee Resettlement Program, is something we do for political reasons, for humanitarian reasons, because it's important for international burden sharing, for international refugee protection. But the real legal obligations that are triggered is in the context of the asylum system.
And I'll give you a chance to answer the last question, and then we're going to wrap up after that. But if I can ask the panelists to stay on the stage for a few minutes, because it seems like there's a lot of appetite to ask some more questions. All right.
I mean, so we're not operational in Jordan. I think the best thing for refugees who are in Jordan or in the region to do is to get in touch with UNHCR to really start that process. So that would be the best thing to do. And on UNHCR's website, they have the location of the office and also an email address and a phone number to contact.
Sure. For most situations, it's not an issue of applying. Most refugees, when they arrive in their country of refuge, they register with the UNHCR, so they tell the UN that they're present in the country, and in most circumstances that gives them access to the services that are available. When you're looking at priority 1 for the United States in terms of resettlement, when you're looking at priority 1 referrals, as Jen mentioned, someone doesn't apply to become part of that program. What happens is that UNHCR evaluates a number of criteria and selects someone to be entered into a resettlement program. So that could be to the US, it could be to other places. So there's not necessarily an application that applies in those circumstances. So as Jen said, it's really a matter of someone getting access to UNHCR, to getting access to the UN, and accessing those services. In terms of our programming, we don't pick and choose which refugees we give services to. So if there's a refugee where we are, we provide them services. So anyone that we have access to, we're helping them as best we can. And so it's, like I said, it's not really an application process. It's more of a, here I am, I need your help. And that's generally how the process works.
All right. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Annie. And thank you all for being engaged in this conversation. If you have any questions, our panelists have graciously agreed to stay on for a few minutes to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Before we break up, we've gone 10 minutes over. Otherwise, trust me, I really wanted to continue this conversation. We have to start lunch promptly at 12:30 because we have to move after lunch from this hotel to the University of Michigan Dearborn, where we have buses taking us. It's on campus where we start the conversation by hearing directly from refugee voices. Lunch is an incredibly important discussion because we're going to hear about, you heard from our panelists that they need to hear more from local communities saying we want to take in refugees. Lunch is devoted to how Michigan is saying, please, this is what we're doing and send us more. So 12:30, just 20 minutes away, right across that hallway. Thank you.